Let's look at the first kind of binding, which is called property binding, right? We will first look at the element property binding, and then we will go and look at component property binding. Because to understand component property binding, we will have to understand how to pass input and output to a component, right? We have not reached that point. So first we will understand how to property bind an element, right? So let's go back to our example, right? This is our example where we have a list of users and we are printing only the user with the id is equal to 4, right? The first way to do property binding on a component is by using interpolation, which we have already done here, right? So whenever you use this double curly braces, you supply the value into that and then you display it on the screen. So this is the first syntactical way of doing the property binding, right? The next way is by using the square brackets. So this also we have seen in the previous examples for ng class and ng style, but they were at the abstract level. Now coming to the actual way of doing the property binding. So once we do this, I think everything will fall into a place for you, right? So the first way is using interpolation. The second way is using square brackets. So let me say I am going to display an image, right? Image which has an src, and this is how we display, right? So my src is present in my user has an avatar, right? If you look at your service, user has something called avatar, and my avatar is the url of the user's image which he has uploaded, right? So user dot avatar, right? Now we can either use interpolation here like this, right? So it will print display the avatar here, the first way, syntactical way of doing property binding. Or instead of using interpolation, the syntax looks little ugly here, right? Whereas here, to display a simple text, to display something like an inner html, to display a string value, it looks very neat and prompt, right? But in this case the syntax looks little ugly. So there is another syntax which can be used, right? Which is using square bracket here, right? Now when you go back, it displays the avatar. Same way, there is another method. Third way of doing it is using the bind prefix. So you can say bind hyphen src, and then it will display the same thing here, right? So there are three types of property binding. The first type is element property binding, and the element property binding can be syntactically done in three ways. One is using interpolation, two is using the square brackets for src, and three is using the bind keyword, right? Bind hyphen src. The next type of property binding is component property binding, right? In element property binding, you binded the data for an attribute of an element, right? From component to DOM. Now from one component to another component, you want to pass the data. Now this is by using at input decorator, right? Now let's go back and see how a component can first accept input from another component, right? And then we can see how the parent can pass the data. There are two steps to it. The first step is how the child component can accept the data from the parent. The second step is how the parent can pass the data to the child. This is my child component, right? Now my child component has to accept a data called message. Now this should be a input from another component. So how do I specify that it is an input is I will have to decorate the field with the input decorator, right? So this is how you decorate. So as you can see, input has got imported from Angular core. Now my parent component, which is the app component here, will be able to pass the data from it using property binding, square brackets, message. It can pass any data. For simplicity, I'm just passing a hard-coded message. I say hello users. Instead of hello users, it can be any data or any attribute from the parents component class. Right? So for now, I've just hard-coded the message here. The user list component, which is a child component, received an input using input decorator. Parent has passed using the component property binding. Now how can I display the data? I can go to user list component and I can say message. As you can see, hello users is displayed here. So these are the two steps which we'll have to think. First, we should make sure that the child is able to receive the data by using at input decorator, and we should pass the data from parent to child using the property binding. You can use any of the three property binding syntaxes. I have used a square bracket syntax. You can use any of the property binding syntax. You will be seeing that I'm using more of a square bracket syntax whenever we are setting an attribute for a component. Whenever we are displaying some data in between the tags like inner HTML or something, we'll be using interpolation, right? Because it looks lot cleaner when we use these two for two different purposes. The third type of property binding is directive property binding, right? So this we have already seen in the previous examples about directives, right? Which are attribute directives, right? Ng class. So this is it, right? Which we have already seen here, right? Directive, using a directive, Ng class directive, we assign a class, right? So these are the three types of property binding. The next unidirectional source to view data binding is attribute data binding, right? Let's look at a small example of how to do attribute data binding. So you can see here I'm trying to display a small table and I'm trying to display just one cell, one row inside that hello, right? Now I want to set a call span property for this TD. Call span is equal to, and I say 2. Call span is equal to 2. I want to pass this call span from my component, right? Say for example, I have something called CL span is equal to 2. I want to set this data in my view. What I can do, I can say CL span, and like we used to do, put it in square brackets, right? And instead of 2, like we used to do, let me enclose it in double quotes and specify call span. Oops, it is a blank page. And just look at the error. It says can't bind to call span since it isn't a known property of TD. We'll have to specify it like attr dot, right? For these kind of attribute data binding where you do not have a corresponding property in the DOM, we will have to specify it as attr dot. Now when you go back and see, you can see that the hello has got printed and there is a TD with a call span of 2. And this is where we use attribute data binding. Like we already discussed, there are three syntactical ways of doing attribute data binding. You can either use square brackets here, or you can use interpolation here, or you can use the keyword bind hyphen. So the key takeaway here is attribute binding can be used for attributes which are present in HTML but not mapped to the properties in DOM, and there are three syntactical ways of doing it: using interpolation, using bind hyphen, and using square brackets. The next kind of binding is class binding, right? Now, in order to look at class binding, we will first bootstrap some of the styles for our components so that it looks better and the classes can be visibly seen by the user. Right, let's try to install a bootstrap module which will give me some default styling for my application. Let's install bootstrap. Now the bootstrap npm module has been installed successfully. Let's go and try to import the bootstrap module so that the styles can be applied to our application. So to import the styles, there is a folder called src, and within that you can see a styles.css. So you can import your bootstrap css like this. When you see node modules, you can find bootstrap folder here, and within that you have the dist folder, and within that you have the css folder. So this is the css folder. Within css you find the bootstrap.css. So you can say at import and you can specify the path to it. Right, now that you have included bootstrap.css in style, let's go back and see how our application looks like. So here you can see that my styles.js size has increased because my style has been bundled into this form styles.js. Whereas if you see in my previous bundling, that the styles is just 16.3 KB. Whereas after I have included the Bootstrap CSS, my styles.js is 830 KB. This indicates that our styles have been included in the application. Now let's go ahead and create a button and specify a class to the button. So I've created a button. Class is equal to btn hyphen primary. As you can see, the button has some styling applied to it, right? So this is how you bootstrap your Angular application. I've just used a very minimal style. You can go ahead and use any style that you want to use for your application, right? Now let's see how we can do class binding to it. Now I want to apply this dynamically. I don't want to apply btn hyphen primary always. So let's see how my button will look like. So this is how my button will look like. Just a very plain, no outline, anything, right? Now only if it is primary, I want it to be styled this way. Some simple use case to understand, right? It is not a very good practice to deal with strings, right, like this, right? So it becomes very complicated when you have a lot of classes that is to be appended with many conditions, right? So there is another way, another good way of doing this. So instead of hard coding strings like this, I can say is primary button is equal to true, right? And then I can go to the component HTML and I can define a class here because every time I need a button, so btn can be there. Now whether it is primary or non-primary is determined based on the variable in my class. So I can say class dot btn hyphen primary is equal to, I can evaluate the condition here, and based on the result of the evaluation I can mention the class name here. So only if this is true, I have to show this class. Otherwise, I should not show this class. So the same result is here. Suppose I go to my component and I make it false. You can see that it is not anymore a primary button. So the value of true or false for my primary button can vary based on my logic in my component. But the class assignment takes place based on whether the condition is evaluated true or not by using class binding in this way. Next topic in property binding is style binding, right? So how can we bind styles in the component, right? So we have to use a dot operator. So style binding is a little bit different when compared to the other binding. We will have to use a dot operator to bind the data from the component to the DOM. So how can I do that? I have a span here, right? For example, I have displayed the data, click here to view the users. So how does it appear now in the front end? It says click here to view the users. I want to display this in red color. I want to apply some inline styles to this and I want to display it in the red color. So we have already seen one way of doing it, which is using the ng style directive attribute directive in the previous videos. This is another way of doing things using style binding, right? So what I can do is, the property binding syntax is square brackets. So I can say style. An addition that we have to do for style binding is use dot operator, and we have to specify what is the attribute which we are trying to bind here, which is color, is equal to, I want to specify a color here, right? From where does my color come? It comes from my component. So in component, I have defined two attributes, which is red color and 10 size. I want to apply these two data. I want to bind these two data onto my view. So I can say style.color is equal to color, which is the value of the color field which is present in the component class. Same way, style.font size is equal to size, which is again coming from my component class. So it is in red color. So as you can see here, the color red is applied, right? I have changed the size also to 10 pixel and it has displayed 10 pixel here. Font size is 10 pixel, right? So this is how you do style binding. So now we are done with all the different types of source to view or component to DOM data binding, right?